Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies, and I want to welcome everyone today. On behalf of Nancy Burns, who's the director of the Department of Political Science here at the University of Michigan, we welcome you to this wonderful event. It's a day-long set of events to honor Ron Engelhardt. Ron is the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Professor in Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights, and a research professor at the Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan. It goes without saying, I think, to everybody in this room that Ron is a giant in the field of political science and political sociology. His work has been enormously influential across a range of fields and subfields. Ron is a kind of legendary in the field of cultural change, democratization, modernization, and in the study of public opinion, especially comparative public opinion. Did I cause that? All right. All set? Okay. Anyway, it's hard to really overstate his influence on a variety of things, as I've said, including not only what we know and the kinds of processes of change that we observe in societies around the world, both in the developed and developing world, but also how we come to know it. And as both a kind of leader of large-scale projects to study public opinion around the world, he has set the standard for the kinds of coordination and cooperation across disparate public opinion units around the world with, for example, his World Values Survey serves as a model. I've been looking forward to this day for a long time. I have been looking forward to the speakers. I've been looking forward to honoring Ron. And Nancy and I have talked about this. And we've invited three speakers here who are very much, obviously, influenced by Ron, students of Ron, but also carrying on the kinds of ideas and methods that he has made so critical to the profession, carrying it forward into new areas of research. So we thought it fitting that we have an event that is really about the research that's happening here and now in these critical areas. And we just have an all-star lineup. We will start with Amaney Jamal, and she is the Edwards S. Sanford Professor of Politics at Princeton and director of the Mamdouha Bobst Center for Peace and Justice. She also directs the workshop on Arab political development. She currently is president of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. The focus of her current research is democratization and the politics of civic engagement in the Arab world. Her interests also include the study of Muslim and Arab Americans and the pathways that structure their patterns of civic engagement in the United States. Her recent book, Barriers of Democracy, won the APSA Best Book Award in Comparative Democratization. She was recently named a Carnegie Scholar. Please join me in welcoming Amaney Jamal to talk about her research.
Thank you, Ken. It's a real honor and privilege to be back here at Michigan. As many of you know, I received my PhD in this program. I'm very fond of the program. I took many courses with Professor Engelhardt, as we call him. So it's really a pleasure and a joy to be here and to present some work that is very much influenced by my being a student of Ron's here. So this project here today is actually, when I received the invitation from Ken, we were almost coming out of the field with this project, and I said this will be a good place, it will be a good deadline for us to try to pull this. We don't have a paper yet, but at least we have the slides. Pull these slides together for this presentation. And the idea here is this older literature in comparative politics and maybe behavior about the influence of, or the role of strain on support for Islamism. And when we talk about Islamism, we're not talking about radical Islamism or extremist Islamism. We're basically talking about support for Islamic political parties in the Middle East, like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Islamic movements that are participating in the mainstream of politics. But if you're a student of Middle East politics, what you've seen in recent years and almost in the last 2 decades or more is that support for these movements, as opposed to your mainstream secular movements, if you may, the support for the Muslim movements have grown even while the societies are undergoing rapid modernization, development, if you may, or secularization. So then the question is, that's puzzled a lot of students of Middle East politics, is why are we seeing the resurgence, if you may, of these Islamic movements or support for these Islamic movements? And in this particular paper, we want to look at the role of strain in structuring support for Islamism. So the idea here is like, what explains individual level support for Islamism? So we're really getting at the micro foundations, relying on public opinion data. This is basically coming out of the textbook of Ron Engelhardt. And our hypothesis here is strained individuals find comfort or divine rewards in Islam and therefore vote for Islamists. And we're juxtaposing this argument against several arguments that sort of argue counter to this. And I'll go through the literature in just a bit. But we're sort of trying to revive this argument about strain and Islamism. And the data we use basically are the Arab Barometer survey data with my co-PI Mark Tesler's here also. Again, we've worked on this, and we were very much influenced by Ron's World Values Survey when we started even thinking about the Arab Barometer, and I'll say more about that maybe this evening. And then we also have conducted some lab experiments in Tunisia to get this. But when we think about the Arab Barometer survey data, or when we look at what's in the Arab Barometer survey data in the way of findings, our argument here is that when we look at the observational data, socioeconomic strain is correlated with support for Islamism, which we'll show. But we want to get at mechanisms, and we want to unpack the endogeneity perhaps, so we also try to experimentally manipulate some of this in the lab. If you look at the existing literature outside of the strain accounts, there are a lot of non-religious explanations that have been put out that explain why Islamism has grown in support across the region. One set of arguments looks at the organizational prowess or the organizational management of these movements. These movements, it's argued that these movements are very well organized. They have a coherent leadership structure and management style. And basically you have quote unquote obedient members that sort of turn out, mobilize, do the work of the movement. And therefore, because they're so well organized, they have these mobilizational advantages. And they also rely on mosques to help with the mobilization. And because mosques are available and plentiful in the region, they tend to have these mobilizational advantages as well. Furthermore, a very large literature has looked at the social service provision of these movements. So here, if you look at the picture, this is basically the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt distributing very cheap vegetables right before the election in a way to sort of showcase their programmatic commitment to help the poor and the needy. So a lot of people have argued, several scholars have argued that it's really that these movements are out there, they're in touch with the poor, they understand the grievances of the poor, so they win a lot of votes, not for religious reasons per se, but they win the votes because they are basically the ones doing the redistribution, if you may. And others have argued, including your colleague Pauline Luong, have argued that it's not necessarily religion per se, but that the religion itself sends signals to voters who are maybe otherwise not very informed or don't have really strong policy positions, but that the religious movements signal purity or quote unquote dedication and commitment, or because they're also seen as they're also seen as more trustworthy and honest, they're going to be more sincere or effective on the economic policies. But nevertheless, this is the whole literature has sort of like placed religion on the side and has tried to argue for these non-religious arguments. In this paper, we're going to go back to the basics, kind of like, well, we do understand when we're doing qualitative work in the region, when we're in focus groups with the region, when we're talking to individuals across contexts, and we're trying to unpack why these Islamist movements, if you may, have an electoral advantage, the role of religion comes up. And so the question that sort of we're trying to grapple with, and it hasn't been easy, so I'm really curious to hear what people say, is what role does religion play in terms of giving these movements or conferring upon these movements an electoral advantage in the political arena? So again, so what role does Islam play? So we'll go back to like Marx, where he argues, religion is the opium of the masses. It reduces alienation. Nietzsche argued that it provides the poor invaluable contentedness with their lot and condition. Durkheim, basically coming out of the sociology of religion, argued that religion resolves the enemy generated from abrupt social dislocations. Lee and Clyde, coming out of the American political context, basically say it reduces normlessness. Norris and Inglehart have argued that religion provides existential security, especially for vulnerable populations. And Shivi and Stasevich, looking more at a more political economy perspective, have argued that religion provides insurance against adverse life effects. So we're trying to get at this side of the literature. So in this literature, especially when you look at modernization accounts, when you think about the story of the Middle East or of other developing societies, those societies confronted with rapid development and dislocation, we understand that there's a lot of strain, there's a lot of enemy that occurs at the individual level. And then in these moments of abrupt social change, there's strain, but people sort of resort to religion. And we want to see whether or not, if people are resorting to religion, are they also becoming, just by default, more likely to vote or support Islamist movements. So this idea is that strain induces need to rely on God to receive divine rewards. We're sort of also contextually basing this argument, which is basically thinking about what Islam sort of dictates in terms of the Islamic discourse, not just Islamist discourse, but the Islamic discourse about divine rewards. And this reliance manifests itself through either increased religiosity and the reliance on God, and then this idea that then because you have become strained and because you've become more religious, you're by default going to support an Islamist movement over a non-Islamist movement. So that we're trying to take out all the other sort of calculations in that equation and just focus on the role of religion. And again, there's a large literature coming out of the Middle East and elsewhere that talks about the sources of strain. So there's economic hardship, there's moral decay, there's social dislocation and with modernization or authoritarianism. But in this talk today, we're going to focus on economic hardship. So our first cut at this question is looking at the Arab Barometer data. We take two slices of the Arab Barometer data, two waves. We're looking at 13 Arab countries with a sample size of about 27,000 observations. And we are trying to get at socioeconomic measures. And the best ways we do that, of course, are looking at income, education, and GDP per capita. Income, as you know, as well as in the World Values Survey, is always a very noisy indicator, especially when you get into the developing world. So we also sort of proxy income for education, and we're also looking at GDP per capita, at least at the country level. Our measure of Islamism is trust in a country's mainstream Islamist party, and we have basically your standard controls: age, gender, marriage, religion, country, and wave fixed effects. And basically the correlation or the data from the Arab Barometer shows, and I'm going to try to unpack this very quickly, is that in poorer countries, the lower you are on the socioeconomic spectrum, the more support for Islamism you exhibit, and that relationship is on the decline as your level of socioeconomic status improves. We see this relationship in poorer countries. In richer countries, we really don't see, this is pretty much a flat line. We don't really see much statistical significance. But however, at least observationally, among poorer countries, if you are poor, you are going to support, you're more likely to be supportive of these political Islamic movements. So we're showing a correlation. We're not getting us any closer to our argument about religion. It's hard for us to observationally or take observational data on religion to say, let's now look at religion, because when we ask these standard measures of religion in the context of the Middle East or the Arab world, almost 99% of people come off as very, very religious. There's a strong social desirability bias for people to say that they're religious even if they're not, so we don't really have much variation to play with. So I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but nevertheless, I mean, people can look at this and say, well, this certainly doesn't debunk the argument that the poor people in poorer societies are probably more reliant on social services, and therefore they're going to be supporting Islamist movements. And Ken, you'll tell me when my time is close to expire. Okay. So far we've shown that socioeconomic strain is correlated with support for Islamism. There could be a lot of reasons. We're trying to get more at the mechanism. And does this mechanism of reliance on God bolster Islamist support? So we're trying to get, and you know, and there could be an endogeneity problem, which is the same factors that are shaping the poverty can be shaping, you know, the Islamism. I'm not going to lecture to the choir here, but nevertheless, we're going to try to get some causal leverage on this. And we're going to more specifically try to test this mechanism. Does support for religious candidates, is that a function of trying to please or rely on God and ensure rewards in the afterlife? So we go to Tunisia. As many of you know, if you've been monitoring the field of Middle East studies, more and more of our students are doing work in Tunisia, because it's not simply that Tunis is a beautiful place on the Mediterranean. It's because, as the events of the Middle East unfortunately have shown, it's very hard to do research and field work in many other cases. So the sample size, if you may, is shrinking. And nevertheless, people will also ask, why are you doing this test in Tunisia? Tunisia is probably it's a much more, quote unquote, if we're going to go down this route, a modern society, a more secular society, has a legacy of French colonial rule. That's all true, but then I just like to say that that's probably this is a very hard test for us if we're going to do it. If we find results in Tunisia, the likelihood of us finding results in Egypt or Jordan or any other country are probably that much higher. So here's what the lab sort of looks like in Tunisia, which is it's a very, actually for I always tell the graduate students and graduate students who are often have really good ideas but are struggling to be able to get into the field. Lab experiments are sort of like economically efficient if you're trying to nail a mechanism of sorts. And so basically we just rent out some space and we're able to set up the shop there. And basically here's some people doing the actual experiment. We have a pre-treatment questionnaire on some demographics. And then the bulk of this experiment here is we have a coordination game. And then we have a post-treatment questionnaire that gets at support for Islamism and some of the mechanisms, or this reliance on God mechanism that we're talking about. So what does the coordination game look like? Basically, we have a sample size of 253 people. We give all the players 5 Tunisian dinars, which is the equivalent of $2 US. And we tell the participants they can either keep their 5 Tunisian dinars or they can play a game. And the game is a very simple game. We tell them that you're going to be playing a game against Hassan, a male name, and Hassan also has 5 dinars. And basically, you could either keep your 5 dinars or you can try to coordinate with Hassan. If you give your 5 dinars and Hassan gives his 5 dinars, we will multiply now the 10 dinars by 4 and we'll divide it between the two of you. So if you give your 5 dinars and Hassan gives his 5 dinars, you'll end up with 20 dinars and he'll end up with 20 dinars. So it's a win-win. If you play and Hassan decides not to play, if you decide to keep, if you play and Hassan decides to keep his 5 dinars, you will lose your 5 dinars. And if you keep your 5 dinars and Hassan plays, he will lose his 5 dinars, and both of you guys can keep and everybody is fine. Nobody wins, nobody loses. So this is basically the setup. The truth is Hassan is not an individual. Hassan is a randomized computer on the tablet, and Hassan will coordinate and not coordinate randomly with the player. So basically, here's sort of the walkthrough. We are now going to play a game with another player. Hassan, who is located in our other side, he will be playing with us online through this tablet. If in this envelope is 5 dinars, you will use this money to play the game. The idea behind the game is that you have the opportunity to multiply your money by 4 times. That's basically what I just explained, so I'm just, for the sake of time, I'm going to go through. So, excuse me, really quickly, 102 people played the game and won the game. 107 people played the game and lost the game, which is great in terms of just balance. And 44 people refused to play the game. And I'd like to talk about them maybe in Q&A. These 44 people, that it turned out, didn't play because, at least when we looked at the data, they were the extremely religious people in our sample, and they felt that this was a gambling game. So they opted not to play, which in a sense is good for us because we really are not trying to influence the very religious already. So it sort of worked out. A priori, we did not expect people, the religious people, to opt out. So, but we can talk more about that. So for now, we exclude them from the analysis. But we have gone back and done some sensitivity and things of that sort, so I'd be happy to talk about it. So really quickly, if you lost the game, if you lost versus won the game, the whole sample, nothing happens. If you're in the you're in the bottom half of the sample, bottom half of the income of that sample, you are more likely to support An-Nahda after controlling for all the covariates. An-Nahda is the mainstream Islamic political movement in Tunisia. And then we asked, trying to get at the mechanism, we also asked after the DVs this question on reliance on God. And so after we did our qualitative work and our focus groups and worked with our partners on the ground, we felt that this would be the adequate question, which is fighting injustice is never worth the cost, fighting injustice is never worth the cost, and we should just rely on God's compensation in the afterlife, right? And this is on a scale from 1 to 5. And the idea is, no, you need to fight injustice in this world because this world matters, versus let it go, and there will be compensation in the afterlife. And what we find is that for the whole sample, again, we have small samples of like 200 in the whole sample, but among the whole sample, we find slight significance that if you lost the game, you were more likely to want to rely on God's compensation in the afterlife, and among the poorer of the half of that sample, much more reliance on God in the afterlife. So up until now, we find a causal effect of strain on Islamism, right? Those who were strained became more supportive of An-Nahda, and strain also causes reliance on God's compensation. So that's where we are basically with the project. I'm going to go one more slide, but just to tie it back to Ron's work, this is basically a cornerstone of what Ron told us 30 years ago. We're just empirically showing this. So we're not pretending to come with anything new here, Ron. We're just really getting at the micro foundations of this. But where we sort of see our contribution is, does embracing Islamism elevate strain? So we're sort of pushing that forward. So again, we go back to the Arab Barometer, which basically what we're looking at are individuals who embrace Islamism. Do they self-report less strain at the same income and education levels? We'll show you a graph. And then in the lab, individuals who embrace Islamism, do they self-report less strain and were less cognitively impaired by losing the game? So how do we get at this? First of all, let's just show the Arab Barometer data. So for the Arab Barometer data, again, going back to our 2 waves of 27,000 plus observations, you'll see that if among people who trust Islamists versus those who don't, the people who have trust in Islamists report less economic strain. Now, this is a subjective measure. This is not your objective measure. This is subjective, like basically, how do you see the future or your overall economic situation? At the same levels, at the same income and education levels, they're reporting less strain than the people who are not embracing Islamism. Furthermore, we borrow from Mani and Shafir a study that they did among the poor, and they strained people with scenarios. But what they do after they strain people with scenarios is that they give them a Raven's matrix to solve. So before I do that, we also have some DVs that we asked about after the game, like, are you stressed? Are you overwhelmed? Or there's like, basically, you could circle 5 of the 16 words to describe how you're feeling. So if you mentioned stressed and overwhelmed, we coded that 2. If you mentioned one of those, we gave you a 1. If you didn't mention either of those, we gave you a 0. So that's one test in the experiment. But then there's the Raven's matrix. And basically, if you get this right, if you pick the right box, you get coded 1. If you pick the wrong one, you get coded 0. So really quickly, what we see is that for the coordination game, among those who lost the game and basically said they're going to rely on God, they reported that among the people who lost, who said they would not rely on God, they reported more stress and overwhelm. We didn't find any significance on the reliance, but on the counter. And similarly, among the people who lost the game, what we found, and they did not rely on God, they were more likely to not solve the matrix. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we're finding is that strain induces Islamism through an intrinsic religious channel, and basically, again, bolstering what we sort of already knew. We use the Arab Barometer and we use experimental data, and then basically what we find is that Islamism decreases cognitive impairment and makes people more content with their economic conditions. In the larger paper, we're going to go back and talk about the economic challenges, right? There's clear policy implications for these findings, but there's clear also, like post-Arab Spring, if you look at average GDP, especially in a country like Tunisia, which is quote unquote the poster child of democracy and revolution, its economic situation is worse today than it was a year before the Arab uprising. So and we're not trying to get into this normative place where like Islamism is bad or Islam is good. We're just saying basically if we want to understand what's going on, we need to understand the underlying economic conditions of these societies. All right, thank you very much.